The man who fired me on my wedding day wasn't my boss. It was his son. Ryan Brooks didn't wait until after the ceremony or even have the decency to send an email. He walked straight into the ballroom 40 minutes before I was supposed to say I do, looked at me in my wedding dress, and announced loud enough for nearly every guest to hear, "Emma Carter, you're terminated, effective immediately." Conversation stopped all around us. The florist froze with a bouquet in her hands. My maid of honor lowered her champagne glass. Even the string quartet missed a note. Ryan smiled, as if he had just delivered the best punchline of his life. He wanted an audience, and unfortunately for him, he got one. Before I tell you what happened next, let me say something to anyone who's ever been humiliated by someone who thought power made them untouchable. Don't mistake a loud person for the strongest person in the room. Sometimes the one staying calm already knows something the loud one doesn't. If stories about workplace betrayal, family loyalty, and satisfying justice are your kind of stories, you're in the right place. Because Ryan Brooks believed he had just destroyed the happiest day of my life, he had no idea he had actually destroyed his own career. My name is Emma Carter. I had spent 11 years working for Brooks Industrial Systems, a manufacturing company that built specialized equipment for hospitals and research laboratories across the country. I started as a logistics coordinator straight out of graduate school and slowly worked my way into operations. It wasn't glamorous work, but I loved solving problems, building reliable systems, and helping factories deliver products that actually mattered. During those 11 years, I had worked through hurricanes, supply chain shortages, and 2 major factory expansions. I missed birthdays, canceled vacations, and once spent Christmas Eve inside a warehouse because a shipment of emergency medical equipment couldn't be delayed. I never complained, because Charles Brooks, the company's founder, had always treated hard work with respect. His son Ryan, however, had inherited the title long before he inherited the character. Ryan officially became executive vice president only 4 months before my wedding. Everyone inside the company understood why. Charles Brooks had recently undergone heart surgery and began stepping back from daily operations. Instead of promoting one of the experienced division presidents, he decided it was finally time to prepare his only son to lead the business someday. Ryan interpreted that decision very differently. To him, executive vice president meant future owner. He began replacing department heads with personal friends, canceling projects he didn't understand, and holding long meetings where confidence mattered far more than competence. Most people kept their heads down and hoped Charles would eventually notice. I did the same, because my responsibility wasn't office politics. It was making sure today 27 manufacturing facilities stayed operational. My wedding was supposed to be the first weekend in years when I completely disconnected from work. David and I had postponed it twice because of the pandemic, and once more because one of our largest hospital contracts required my direct supervision. By the time the ceremony finally arrived, almost everyone at Brooks Industrial knew how much we had sacrificed to reach that day. My out-of-office message had been scheduled for months. Every major project had been handed to other managers. Even Charles Brooks had sent a handwritten card wishing us happiness and reminding me that the company would survive 48 hours without me. Looking back now, I sometimes wonder whether Ryan saw that card on his father's desk. Maybe that was the moment he decided my wedding would become his stage. I was standing near the ballroom entrance talking with my father when Ryan walked in, wearing an expensive navy suit and no invitation badge. 2 members of our sales team followed behind him looking deeply uncomfortable, as though they had tried to convince him not to come. He didn't congratulate us. He didn't shake David's hand. He didn't even acknowledge my parents. Instead, he pulled a white envelope from inside his jacket and held it between two fingers. "Corporate business," he announced. "This won't take long." My wedding planner politely stepped forward and explained that the ceremony would begin shortly, but Ryan ignored her completely. He looked directly at me and smiled. "After reviewing your recent performance," he said, "the company has decided to eliminate your position, effective immediately." For a moment, I genuinely thought it was some kind of cruel joke. Then he removed a termination letter from the envelope and held it out toward me. "You'll receive your final compensation according to company policy," he continued. "Please return all company property by Monday morning." Around us, guests exchanged confused looks. Some recognized Ryan from company events. Others assumed there had been some terrible misunderstanding. David walked to my side and calmly asked, "Can this wait until after the wedding?" Ryan laughed. Actually laughed. "Business doesn't stop because someone booked a ballroom," he replied. Then he added the sentence I don't think I'll ever forget. "Frankly, Emma should have been focusing more on work than planning centerpieces." I took the letter without unfolding it. Years of working in operations had taught me something valuable. Never react before you understand what you're looking at. Ryan clearly expected tears, anger, or public humiliation. Instead, I simply asked one question. "Did Charles Brooks authorize this?" His smile became noticeably tighter. "The CEO doesn't review every personnel decision anymore," he answered. "That's my responsibility now." I nodded once and slipped the envelope onto a nearby table without reading it. That seemed to irritate him far more than if I had argued. "That's it?" he asked loudly. "No speech, no begging." I met his eyes. "It's my wedding day, Ryan. I'm not giving you the scene you came here for." He looked disappointed. But before he could say anything else, my phone vibrated inside the small white clutch I was carrying. Normally, I would have ignored it. Every guest knew I planned to turn my phone off before walking down the aisle. But the screen displayed a name that made my heart stop for an entirely different reason. Charles Brooks. To know. The company's founder had never called me on a Saturday in 11 years. I answered immediately. So, the first thing he said was, "Emma, where's Ryan?" I stepped away from the growing circle of confused guests and answered the call as calmly as I could. "Good afternoon, Mr. Brooks?" His voice sounded weaker than usual, but not uncertain. "Emma, I need you to answer one question before you say anything else. Sterile with you?" I looked across the ballroom. Ryan was standing exactly where he wanted to be, surrounded by my wedding guests, with the confidence of a man convinced he had just made an unforgettable entrance. "Yes," I replied. "He's here." Charles exhaled slowly. "Has he done something incredibly foolish?" I didn't answer immediately because I had learned years ago that people reveal more when you don't rush to fill silence. Finally, I said, "He just terminated my employment in front of about 100 people." There was no response for several seconds. Then Charles quietly said, "Don't leave. I'm coming." I frowned instinctively. "Mr. Brooks, you should be resting. The hospital discharged you 3 days ago." "Emma," he interrupted, "I'm not asking. Keep everyone exactly where they are if you can." Before I could respond, the line went dead. I stared at my phone for a moment before slipping it back into my purse. Ryan noticed the call immediately. Trying to appeal the decision, he asked loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. "That's not how executive authority works." I looked at him carefully. For someone so eager to demonstrate power, he seemed strangely interested in whether I had spoken to his father. That told me something important. Either Charles didn't know Ryan had come, or Ryan desperately hoped he wouldn't find out until later. David quietly took my hand as the room buzzed with whispered conversations. "What did Charles say?" he asked. "He's coming." David blinked once. "Here." I nodded. Apparently, my father, who had spent 35 years as a high school principal, leaned closer and spoke in the same calm voice he used whenever students thought they had outsmarted themselves. "Emma, your ceremony starts in 35 minutes. Do you want to postpone?" I looked toward the ballroom doors where family members had begun gathering for photographs. My mother was pretending everything was normal, while my maid of honor kept reassuring increasingly confused guests that we would begin shortly. Ryan, meanwhile, had decided to continue his performance. He was explaining to one of our suppliers that difficult leadership decisions sometimes had to be made, regardless of personal circumstances. I almost admired the confidence. Almost. The ballroom manager approached me carefully and asked whether everything was all right. Before I could answer, Ryan stepped in. "Corporate issue," he said dismissively. "Nothing the venue needs to worry about." The manager looked unconvinced, but nodded politely. As she walked away, one of my coworkers, Lisa Hernandez from procurement, came over holding the termination letter Ryan had left on the table. "Emma," she whispered, "have you actually read this?" I shook my head. She hesitated before handing it to me. "You probably should." I unfolded the letter for the first time. At a glance, it looked official. Company letterhead, my name, effective immediately. But something felt wrong almost instantly. The signature block listed Ryan Brooks as Executive Vice President with full personnel authority. I frowned because that wasn't how Brooks Industrial handled executive dismissals. Senior directors weren't terminated by one signature. Company policy required review by human resources and final approval from the CEO. I knew because I had helped rewrite that policy 2 years earlier. "Interesting," I said quietly, folding the letter again. David recognized the look on my face immediately. "What's wrong?" "Either the policy changed without telling anyone," I replied, "or Ryan is counting on nobody here knowing how executive terminations actually work." Lisa glanced nervously toward Ryan before lowering her voice even further. "HR wasn't informed about this. I know because Jennifer called me 15 minutes ago asking if I'd seen you." That confirmed it. Whatever Ryan thought he was doing, he hadn't followed company procedure. The question was whether he believed he no longer needed to. 15 minutes later, a black sedan pulled into the circular driveway outside the ballroom. I recognized it before the valet even opened the rear door. Charles Brooks rarely drove himself anywhere anymore, and everyone inside the company knew that car. Conversations near the entrance stopped almost immediately. Ryan turned toward the windows with an expression I hadn't seen on his face all afternoon. Surprise. Genuine surprise. Charles stepped out more slowly than usual, supported by a cane in one hand, but refusing assistance from his driver. He looked older than he had only a week earlier, yet the moment he straightened his jacket and began walking toward the entrance, there was something unmistakably familiar about him. He wasn't arriving as a recovering patient. He was arriving as the man who had built Brooks Industrial from a rented warehouse into a company employing thousands of people. The ballroom doors opened, and Charles entered to complete silence. Several employees instinctively stood straighter. A few longtime suppliers greeted him respectfully, but he acknowledged almost no one. His eyes searched the room until they found me standing beside David. He walked directly toward us, stopped, and smiled warmly. "Emma," he said, "you look exactly like someone who should be thinking about her wedding instead of my company." Then he turned toward David and extended his hand. "I'm sorry my family interrupted your day." David shook it firmly. "We're just glad you're feeling well." Charles nodded once before facing Ryan. The warmth disappeared from his expression without a single raised voice. Then, "Son," he said evenly, "I'd like to know why one of my senior directors is holding a termination letter she shouldn't have received." Ryan glanced briefly around the room, clearly aware that every employee present was now listening. "Dad, I already handled it," he replied confidently. "Emma's position is no longer aligned with our future strategy." Charles held out his hand. "May I see the letter?" Ryan hesitated for only a fraction of a second before passing it over. Charles read the first page quietly, then turned it over and looked at the signature block. When he finished, he folded it carefully and slipped it into his jacket pocket. "Ryan," he asked, "who authorized you to bypass human resources, legal, and my office?" Ryan answered immediately. "I'm Executive Vice President." Charles looked at him for a long moment before speaking again. "No," he said quietly enough that everyone leaned forward to hear. "You're Executive Vice President under the authority I delegated to you." He paused, just long enough for the distinction to settle over the room. "Those are not the same thing." No one moved. No one spoke. Then Charles reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, removed his own phone, and dialed a number from memory. When the call connected, he said only one sentence. "Solucia." Karen erupted. "Suspend my son's company access immediately and tell the board we're meeting in 1 hour." The silence inside the ballroom lasted only a few seconds, but it felt much longer. Ryan stared at his father as though he had misheard him. "Dad," he said with an uneasy laugh, "there's no need to make a scene. This is an internal management decision." Charles Brooks didn't respond immediately. Instead, he slipped his phone back into his pocket and looked around the room at the employees, suppliers, and family members who had unintentionally become witnesses to something far larger than a disrupted wedding. "No," he said calmly. "The scene was made when you chose someone else's wedding as your conference room." Ryan opened his mouth to argue again, but before he could speak, his own phone vibrated repeatedly. He glanced down at the screen, and for the first time all afternoon, the confidence disappeared from his face. One notification after another appeared across the display. Corporate email access revoked. VPN access disabled. Executive building credentials suspended. Then came a final message from Human Resources requesting the immediate return of all company-issued devices pending executive review. Around us, several employees quietly exchanged glances. Brooks Industrial had one policy everyone knew by heart. Charles Brooks never suspended executive access unless he believed the company itself might be at risk. Charles finally turned back toward me. "Emma," he said, "I owe you an apology. But I also owe your guests an explanation." I shook my head gently. "Mr. Brooks, today isn't about the company. He gave a tired smile. Unfortunately, my son made sure it became about the company. Then he faced everyone gathered nearby. Ladies and gentlemen, I sincerely apologize for interrupting what should have been one of the happiest days in this family's life. Ms. Emma Carter remains an employee of Brooks Industrial Systems. Any document suggesting otherwise was issued without proper authority and is therefore invalid. The tension inside the ballroom shifted almost instantly. Guests who had spent the last half hour wondering whether I had secretly done something terrible now understood that the problem wasn't my performance. It was Ryan. I didn't feel victorious. Mostly, I felt relieved that David and our families no longer had to carry questions that should never have existed in the first place. Ryan stepped closer to his father, lowering his voice in an obvious attempt to keep the conversation private. "You're embarrassing me." Charles looked at him almost sadly. "No, Ryan. You embarrassed yourself the moment you confused authority with ownership." Then he reached into his jacket again and handed me the termination letter. "Keep this," he said quietly. "You may need it later." That surprised me. If the letter was invalid, why preserve it? Charles seemed to read the question on my face before I asked it. "Because every important decision leaves a paper trail," he replied. "And paper trails tell stories people eventually regret writing." It was exactly the sort of advice that had built Brooks Industrial into one of the most respected companies in the state. Ryan, however, looked less interested in paper trails than in escaping the room before anyone else could watch his authority disappear. The wedding coordinator gently approached David and me with a hesitant smile. "Whenever you're ready," she whispered. "Your guests are ready too." David looked at me, silently giving me the choice. We could postpone everything and spend the afternoon dealing with corporate chaos, or we could refuse to let Ryan steal another minute from a day we had waited 3 years to celebrate. I squeezed his hand. "Let's get married." A ripple of quiet relief spread through the room as musicians returned to their places and family members found their seats again. Charles stepped aside without another word, taking a seat in the last row rather than the front. He clearly understood this wasn't his moment either. As the doors opened and the music finally began, I realized Ryan had vanished. Whether he had left because he was angry or because he suddenly understood how many witnesses had just watched his humiliation, I honestly didn't know. The ceremony itself lasted barely 20 minutes, yet it became the calmest part of an otherwise unbelievable day. Standing across from David, listening to vows we had written months earlier, reminded me how small the company suddenly felt compared with the life we were promising each other. Brooks Industrial had been my career, not my identity. Ryan had assumed taking one away would destroy the other. He had never understood that people who build their lives on purpose are much harder to break than people who build theirs on titles. When the officiant pronounced us husband and wife, the applause filling the ballroom sounded warmer than I had imagined all morning. Even Charles smiled openly as David kissed me, and for a few precious minutes, the business world disappeared completely. That piece ended during the reception. While guests enjoyed dinner, my maid of honor quietly handed me my phone. "I think you should see this before someone else tells you." Sterile, the company-wide employee portal had already been updated. Charles Brooks had issued a brief statement announcing that Executive Vice President Ryan Brooks had been placed on administrative leave pending an internal review of executive conduct and governance procedures. The notice was only 6 sentences long, but one paragraph stood out immediately. Any personnel actions authorized solely by Mr. Ryan Brooks within the last 30 days will be reviewed for policy compliance. I looked up from the screen. 30 days. Ryan hadn't targeted only me. If Charles was reviewing every decision, he suspected a much larger problem than a single reckless firing. Before I could process that thought, Karen Ellis, the company's vice president of human resources, arrived quietly at our reception. She apologized for interrupting and asked whether she could speak with Charles privately. They stepped into a small meeting room beside the ballroom for several minutes, for Charles returned alone. This time, his expression had changed. The disappointment was still there, but now it was accompanied by something far more serious. He walked directly toward David and me, waited until our conversation with family members ended, and spoke so softly that only the three of us could hear. "Emma," he said, "I need to ask you a favor, and I hate asking it today of all days." I smiled politely. "What is it?" He hesitated, which was something I had almost never seen him do in 11 years. "I don't think your termination letter was the reason Ryan came here. I believe." A chill ran through me. "There? What do you mean?" Charles looked toward the closed meeting room where Karen was still reviewing documents. "HR just discovered something. So," he lowered his voice even further, "maybe someone has been approving multi-million-dollar contracts using your executive authorization." No, for a moment I forgot I was still wearing a wedding dress. Charles's words cut through everything else happening around us. "Using my authorization," I repeated quietly. Karen Ellis joined us a moment later, carrying a slim black folder and an expression I had never seen on her face in all the years we had worked together. Karen wasn't easily rattled. She had handled labor disputes, factory accidents, and 2 corporate acquisitions without ever appearing flustered. Now she looked genuinely concerned. "Emma," she said, "we didn't want to discuss this in front of everyone, but we also don't think it can wait until Monday." David immediately offered to give us privacy, but Charles shook his head. "No. If this affects Emma professionally, it affects both of you now." David remained beside me, quietly placing his hand over mine as Karen opened the folder. Inside were printed copies of 6 executive approvals issued over the previous 5 weeks. At first glance, they looked perfectly legitimate. My name appeared as approving executive on each document, authorizing emergency vendor substitutions for several high-value manufacturing contracts. Anyone unfamiliar with our internal system would have assumed I had personally signed every page. The problem was simple. I had never seen any of them before. "These aren't mine," I said almost immediately. Karen nodded. "We know." She slid another page toward me. "Because you were in Denver leading the St. Anne's Hospital installation, on the same dates these approvals were supposedly signed from corporate headquarters." I studied the timestamps carefully. Every authorization had been entered late in the evening, always between 9:30 and 11 o'clock p.m., long after I had finished work each day. Whoever created them understood my schedule well enough to choose times when nobody would expect to see me in the office. Charles folded his hands across the table. "Do you remember telling Ryan that your executive credentials should never be shared?" I did. 6 months earlier, during a leadership workshop, Ryan had complained that our approval process was too slow. He suggested senior directors leave digital authorization tokens with their assistants to speed up purchasing decisions. I had objected immediately because our manufacturing contracts involved hospitals, research laboratories, and government buyers. Security existed for a reason. Charles had agreed with me during the meeting, and the policy remained unchanged. Ryan wasn't happy, I admitted. He said I was making operations unnecessarily complicated. Karen gave a slow nod. After today's events, our cybersecurity team checked the approval logs. Someone attempted to access your executive credentials repeatedly during that same week. I felt my stomach tighten. The termination letter had never been the real objective. If Ryan could remove me from the company before questions surfaced, the fraudulent approvals might have remained attached to my name. The deeper we looked, the clearer the pattern became. Every questionable contract involved a new supplier Ryan had personally recommended after becoming executive vice president. None of those vendors had previous relationships with Brooks Industrial, and several had submitted prices significantly higher than our long-term partners. Under normal circumstances, my department would have flagged those discrepancies immediately. Instead, someone had inserted approvals carrying my digital signature before procurement reviews were completed. The total value is just over $18 million, Karen explained. Not all of that money has been paid, but several purchase orders have already been issued. David looked at me in disbelief. Someone tried to frame you for this? I answered honestly. Or make sure I couldn't challenge it. Charles leaned back slowly, disappointment written across his face. I thought Ryan was trying to prove he could lead aggressively, he admitted. I never imagined he might try to remove the people most likely to question him. There was no anger in his voice anymore, only the exhaustion of a father realizing his son had mistaken ambition for entitlement. I respected Charles enough not to comment. Families are complicated, even without boardrooms involved, and today had already forced him to choose between protecting his son and protecting the company he had spent 40 years building. He looked at me after several moments of silence. Emma, I need you to do one last thing before you enjoy the rest of your wedding. I smiled faintly. I've learned that sentence usually means the day is about to become even longer. Karen placed a printed activity log on the table. Tomorrow morning, the board will begin its review, she said. Tonight, I only need you to tell me whether any of these login locations or approval times belong to you. We worked through the list together, one entry at a time. The process took less than 15 minutes because every questionable authorization was easy to eliminate. On one date, David and I had been meeting with our wedding photographer. Another evening, I was attending my niece's school concert. 2 approvals were supposedly completed while I was visiting one of our manufacturing plants nearly 300 miles away. Every answer strengthened the timeline. Whoever used my credentials hadn't simply forged approvals. They had counted on nobody verifying where I actually was. When we finished, Karen closed the folder with obvious relief.
That's enough,
She said.
The audit team can take it from here.
Charles stood, shook David's hand, and apologized once again for everything Ryan had done.
Your wedding should never have become part of my company's problems,
He said sincerely. David smiled. Then let's make sure it ends as a wedding. Charles finally laughed for the first time that afternoon.
I think your wife has already solved enough problems for one day.
Before leaving, he handed me his business card with a handwritten number on the back.
This reaches me directly,
He said.
No assistance, no office. If anyone contacts you about those contracts before the board meeting, I want to know immediately.
The reception slowly returned to normal after Charles and Karen left, but I couldn't stop replaying one detail in my mind. Ryan hadn't fired me because he disliked me. He fired me because I was standing between him and something much larger. Around 10 o'clock that evening, after most of our guests had gone home, I finally opened my work email from a secure backup account I kept for emergencies. I wasn't expecting to find much because corporate access had already begun changing after today's events. Instead, One unread message immediately caught my attention. It had been sent anonymously 3 days earlier, with no subject line and only a single attachment labeled, "Read before Monday." I clicked it open. It wasn't a spreadsheet. It wasn't a contract. It was a screenshot of an internal executive chat. At the very top, beside Ryan Brooks's name, was one sentence that made every event of my wedding day suddenly make sense. Geez, fire Emma before the audit starts. I read the screenshot 3 times before handing my phone to David. The message wasn't long, but it didn't need to be. Ryan's name appeared at the top of the executive chat, followed by a single instruction: fire Emma before the audit starts. Below it, someone whose name had been cropped from the image replied, "Too risky, she'll ask questions." Ryan answered only 5 minutes later, "She won't be here after Saturday." There were no emojis, no dramatic threats, nothing that sounded emotional. That was what made it unsettling. Whoever participated in that conversation wasn't arguing about whether I should be removed. They were discussing the timing, as though my career were simply another task on a project schedule. David looked at the screen, then back at me. "Who sent this?" he asked. I shook my head. Anonymous account, no signature, no explanation. The timestamp showed the message had arrived 3 days earlier, while we were finishing seating arrangements for the wedding. I had never opened it because I refused to check work emails during the final week before the ceremony. Ironically, the decision Ryan probably expected had delayed the very evidence that could expose him. The following Monday, I arrived at Brooks Industrial before sunrise. For 11 years, I had entered through the same employee entrance, greeted the same security officers, and walked the same hallway toward operations. That morning felt different. Word of Ryan's suspension had already spread across every department. People tried not to stare, but uncertainty hung over the building. Some employees worried about layoffs. Others feared the company itself was in trouble. Charles had instructed everyone to continue working as normal, yet everyone understood there was nothing normal about placing the founder's only son on administrative leave. Karen met me in the executive conference room with 2 members of the internal audit team and a representative from the company's outside legal counsel. She placed the anonymous screenshot beside the forged approvals we had reviewed at my wedding. "If this image is authentic," she said, "it establishes motive. Now we need to establish who else participated in that conversation." The company's information security manager joined us a few minutes later, carrying a laptop loaded with server logs. He explained that Brooks Industrial archived every executive message, even if users later deleted them. Ryan apparently hadn't known that. Within half an hour, the team recovered the original conversation. The cropped participant turned out to be Martin Ellis, Vice President of Procurement, a 20-year employee with an excellent reputation. Karen frowned immediately. "That doesn't make sense," she said. "Martin has never been part of Ryan's inner circle." Charles, who had quietly entered the room moments earlier, asked for the full conversation instead of isolated messages. As the thread appeared on the screen, the context changed completely. Martin had repeatedly warned Ryan that bypassing procurement controls violated company policy. He objected to replacing approved vendors without competitive review and specifically refused to sign several emergency purchase requests. Ryan's response had been blunt. "If Emma stays in operations, she'll kill every deal before we close it." Suddenly, the firing wasn't just retaliation. It was an attempt to remove the one executive most likely to stop unauthorized contracts before they became legally binding. Martin himself arrived shortly afterward, visibly nervous but carrying 3 thick binders. I wasn't sure anyone would believe me. he admitted as he placed them on the table. So I started keeping copies. Inside were procurement evaluations comparing Ryan's preferred vendors with Brooks Industrial's longtime suppliers. The differences were staggering. Several of Ryan's companies charged 30 to 40% above market rates, while offering shorter warranties and slower delivery schedules. One vendor had been incorporated only 6 weeks before receiving a proposed $7 million manufacturing contract. Another listed the same mailing address as a consulting firm Daniel Brooks Ryan's college roommate had quietly acquired the previous year. None of this proved criminal intent by itself, but together, it painted a troubling picture. Ryan wasn't modernizing procurement as he had claimed. He was steering major contracts toward businesses that should never have passed basic due diligence. Charles listened without interrupting while Martin finished his presentation. When the room finally fell quiet, he removed his reading glasses and rubbed his eyes for several seconds. 42 years, he said softly. I spent 42 years telling people this company would outlive me because systems matter more than personalities. He looked around the conference table before continuing. The only reason we're uncovering this now is because those systems still worked, even after someone tried to bypass them. Then he turned toward me. Emma, if Ryan had succeeded in removing you on Saturday, would anyone else have questioned these contracts? I answered honestly. Eventually, yes. But probably after the purchase orders were finalized. Karen nodded in agreement, which means the financial damage would have been far more difficult to reverse. Late that afternoon, the board of directors convened an emergency governance meeting. Ryan attended with private legal counsel and looked dramatically different from the man who had walked into my wedding ballroom only 48 hours earlier. The confidence was still there, but it was now mixed with visible frustration. He insisted every decision had been made in the company's best interests and argued that senior leadership resisted necessary change simply because they disliked his management style. Charles allowed him to speak without interruption. Only after Ryan finished did Karen distribute the audit summary to every board member. It included the forged executive approvals, the procurement comparisons, the server logs, Martin's preserved correspondence, and the anonymous message instructing someone to fire me before the audit began. Nobody in the room raised their voice. They didn't need to. Facts have a way of making dramatic speeches sound surprisingly small. Ryan's attorney argued that the anonymous screenshot could not be independently verified. Karen calmly replied that it no longer needed to be, because the company's archive servers contained the original conversation in its entirety. Martin confirmed under oath that he had objected to the contracts repeatedly, while the cybersecurity team verified that my executive credentials had been targeted from Ryan's office network on multiple occasions. Piece by piece, the explanation Ryan offered at my wedding unraveled. He hadn't fired me because of poor performance. He fired me because an internal audit threatened decisions he could no longer justify. The board chair looked toward Charles before asking the final question of the afternoon. Mr. Brooks, as founder and chief executive, what action are you recommending? Charles didn't answer immediately. He looked first at me, Jim, then at Ryan. I missed. Finally, he slid a sealed envelope across the conference table. This, he said quietly, isn't a termination letter. Ryan frowned. Mother love. Then what is it? Charles met his son's eyes. It's the notice ordering an independent forensic investigation into every executive decision you've made since the day I promoted you. The room remained silent after Charles placed the investigation notice on the table. Ryan looked at the envelope as though refusing to touch it might somehow make it disappear. His attorney carefully opened it instead, scanned the first page, and immediately stopped speaking. The document authorized an independent forensic accounting firm, outside legal counsel, and cybersecurity specialists to review every executive approval, vendor contract, procurement decision, and financial authorization Ryan had issued since becoming executive vice president. There would be no internal committee quietly settling disagreements behind closed doors. Charles had deliberately chosen outside investigators whose reputations depended on independence rather than loyalty. Ryan finally looked at his father. "You're treating me like a criminal," Charles answered without raising his voice. "No, I'm treating you exactly the way every other executive would be treated if evidence suggested company policy had been deliberately bypassed. The fact that you're my son is the only reason this conversation hurts." The investigation moved far faster than anyone expected because most of the evidence had already been preserved before Ryan realized people were asking questions. Cybersecurity specialists confirmed that repeated attempts had been made to access my executive credentials from devices assigned to Ryan's office suite. Procurement auditors identified 4 proposed vendors with overlapping ownership structures connected through holding companies that ultimately traced back to investors who had privately financed one of Ryan's personal business ventures. None of the findings alone proved embezzlement, but together they established a pattern that no responsible board could ignore. The investigators also confirmed something that made Karen quietly shake her head in disbelief. Ryan had never successfully bypassed the company's core financial controls. Every fraudulent approval stalled only because someone inside operations continued questioning irregularities before payments could be completed. Without realizing it, my department had been protecting the company long before anyone understood what we were protecting it from. 3 days into the investigation, Charles asked me to join him for coffee in the small conference room overlooking the original factory floor. It was the first building Brooks Industrial had ever owned, and he often came there when he needed to think. "I owe you more than an apology," he admitted after we sat down. "I spent months believing Ryan simply needed experience. Instead, I ignored warning signs because I wanted to believe good intentions could replace good judgment." I understood the weight behind those words. Every parent wants to believe their child deserves another chance. Every founder hopes the next generation will protect what took decades to build. "You didn't create his decisions," I replied quietly. Charles nodded. "No, but I created the opportunity for them." He looked out through the glass toward employees beginning another ordinary workday. "The hardest part isn't losing confidence in a leader. It's realizing everyone else saw the problem before you did." That afternoon, the investigators interviewed employees from every major division. What surprised me wasn't how many people had concerns about Ryan. It was how consistently those concerns matched one another. Plant managers described pressure to approve vendors before technical reviews were complete. Finance staff reported unusual requests to split large payments into smaller approvals. Procurement specialists recalled being told that old procedures slowed innovation. Nobody described one dramatic act of corruption. Instead, they described dozens of smaller decisions that gradually weakened safeguards built over decades. Ryan hadn't tried to destroy Brooks Industrial overnight. He had tried to convince everyone that rules designed to protect the company were outdated obstacles standing in the way of progress. Listening to those interviews reminded me of something Charles had once told our leadership team. Companies rarely fail because of one terrible decision. They fail because people stop questioning many smaller ones. Near the end of the first week, the forensic accountants delivered their preliminary findings to the board. The total financial exposure exceeded $23 million in proposed contracts, although investigators confirmed that less than $2 million had actually left company accounts before the audit interrupted the process. The difference mattered enormously. Because procurement controls remained partially intact, Brooks Industrial had avoided catastrophic losses despite Ryan's efforts. Karen quietly smiled at me after the presentation ended. "You realize what this means?" she asked. I wasn't sure. "Your operations team didn't just detect inconsistencies," she explained. "Without knowing it, they prevented one of the largest procurement failures in company history." I hadn't thought about it that way. For weeks, I had focused on defending my own reputation. Now it became clear the real story wasn't that someone tried to frame me. It was that dozens of ordinary employees had continued doing their jobs carefully enough to stop a much larger disaster. The board reconvened the following Monday for its final governance session. Ryan appeared noticeably different from the confident executive who had walked into my wedding reception. He spoke less, listened more, and no longer insisted everything had been misunderstood. His attorney acknowledged procedural failures, but argued they resulted from inexperience rather than dishonest intent. The independent investigators disagreed. Sterile report concluded that executive authority had been repeatedly used in ways inconsistent with company policy, procurement standards, and fiduciary responsibilities. While they stopped short of making criminal conclusions that responsibility belonged to regulators if necessary, they recommended Ryan's immediate removal from all management positions and permanent restrictions on future executive authority within Brooks Industrial. Charles listened without interrupting. When the board voted, the decision was unanimous. After the meeting ended, Ryan approached me alone in the nearly empty hallway outside the boardroom. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, he sighed and said, "You could have walked away after the wedding." I looked at him calmly. "I was trying to—" He frowned, not understanding. "You came to my wedding, Ryan. I never brought Brooks Industrial into that ballroom. You did." He looked down at the floor before speaking again. "I honestly thought you were standing in my way." I answered with the truth that had become painfully obvious over the previous week. "No. I was standing in front of the company you were supposed to protect." He gave a small, almost defeated nod. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't forgiveness. It was simply the first honest thing I had heard him say. 2 hours later, Charles called an all-employee meeting, broadcast to every facility across the country. He announced leadership changes, thanked the independent investigators, and publicly acknowledged the employees whose professionalism had prevented far greater damage. Then, to my complete surprise, he asked me to join him on stage. Brooks Industrial has always believed leadership means protecting the people who depend on your decisions, he said. Emma Carter demonstrated exactly that, even when someone attempted to punish her for doing the right thing. He paused before smiling warmly. Effective immediately, Emma will serve as our new Chief Operating Officer. I stood there for a moment, almost unable to process what I had heard. I hadn't spent 11 years working toward a title. I had spent 11 years trying to build systems that helped other people succeed. Somehow, had become the qualification Charles trusted most. As the applause filled the auditorium, my phone vibrated with a message from David. "Good. Now can my wife finally enjoy her honeymoon?" For the first time since Ryan walked into our wedding, I laughed without thinking about the company. What number 3? Accepting the position of Chief Operating Officer wasn't the victory I imagined people believed it was. Promotions make headlines. Responsibility changes lives. During the weeks that followed the board's decision, my office overlooked the same manufacturing floor I had walked through as a young coordinator 11 years earlier. But everything felt different now. Every approval carried greater consequences. Every hiring decision affected families instead of departments. Every policy I signed would eventually shape someone's ordinary workday in ways they might never notice. Charles visited my office on my first morning as COO, carrying nothing except 2 coffee cups and an old notebook whose cover had nearly worn away. "I kept this from the company's first year," he said, placing it on my desk. Sterile were handwritten lists of equipment repairs, overdue invoices, customer complaints, and payroll reminders from a time when Brooks Industrial employed fewer than 20 people. On the final page, he had written a sentence that explained why the company had survived 4 decades. "Never build a business that depends on one person's ego. Build one that survives because ordinary people can trust the system." Those words became the foundation for everything we changed over the following months. Procurement approvals once again required independent review from operations, finance, and legal before any major contract moved forward. Executive credential security was redesigned so that no individual, not even the CEO, could bypass critical financial safeguards without leaving multiple documented records. Karen introduced mandatory ethics training for every executive officer, while Martin helped rebuild vendor evaluation procedures from the ground up. None of those reforms were glamorous, and none attracted newspaper headlines, but together they restored something far more valuable than public attention. Employees began trusting the company again. Factory managers stopped wondering whether shortcuts would suddenly become policy. Suppliers understood that relationships would once again be earned through performance rather than personal connections. Brooks Industrial wasn't recovering because one person had saved it. It was recovering because hundreds of people quietly returned to doing honest work inside a system that respected honesty. Charles gradually stepped further away from daily operations as his health improved. One afternoon, he asked me to join him in the original conference room where he had interviewed me 11 years earlier. The furniture had changed, the walls had been repainted, and the company had grown beyond anything either of us imagined back then. Yet the room still carried the same quiet sense of purpose. "Emma," he said, "I've spent months asking myself where I failed Ryan." I didn't answer immediately because some questions deserve reflection instead of reassurance. Finally, I said, "You gave him opportunities. What he chose to do with them belongs to him." Charles smiled sadly. "I know. Fathers simply wish the math worked differently." He reached into his briefcase and handed me a small framed photograph taken at my wedding. It showed David and me laughing during the reception, completely unaware someone had captured Charles smiling in the background. "Keep this in your office," he said. "Not because it reminds you of the worst day at work, because it reminds you there are things more important than work." Ryan never returned to Brooks Industrial. Following the board's decision, he resigned from every remaining corporate position and later accepted responsibility for several governance violations as part of agreements reached with regulators and the company's insurers. The legal process unfolded quietly over many months, and I won't pretend every outcome was dramatic. Real accountability rarely arrives in a single courtroom speech. More often, it appears through financial settlements, professional restrictions, damaged reputations, and opportunities that never come back. I heard through mutual acquaintances that Ryan eventually found work outside the manufacturing industry. I genuinely hope he learned something from everything that happened. Wishing permanent failure on someone has never repaired a single wrong, but neither does pretending serious decisions carry no consequences. Some lessons simply cost more than others. David and I finally took the honeymoon we had postponed after the wedding. We rented a small cabin overlooking a quiet lake where neither of us checked work email for an entire week. On our second evening there, we sat on the porch watching the sunset when David asked the question everyone else seemed too polite to mention. If Ryan had waited until Monday, instead of showing up at our wedding, do you think he would have gotten away with it? I considered the question carefully before answering. Maybe for a little while. He nodded thoughtfully. So why come that day? I smiled because I finally understood the answer. He wanted control more than success. People chasing success usually think long term. People chasing control make emotional decisions. David laughed softly. Good thing you married an architect instead of a philosopher. I leaned against his shoulder. Good thing I married someone who reminded me what actually mattered. Several months later, Brooks Industrial held its annual Employee Appreciation Banquet. Unlike the board meetings and audit sessions that had dominated so much of the previous year, this evening was intentionally simple. Families filled the ballroom, children ran between tables, retirees shared stories from the company's earliest days, and Charles gave one of the shortest speeches anyone could remember. Instead of talking about revenue or expansion, he thanked employees for protecting the culture that built the business in the first place. Near the end of the evening, he surprised me one final time by presenting a framed copy of the termination letter Ryan had handed me on my wedding day. Across the front, Charles had stamped one word in bold blue ink. Void. Bobanda. Everyone laughed as he handed it to me. I considered shredding it, he admitted. But then I realized it belongs in company history. I looked at the letter for a long moment before smiling. Lim. It reminds us what happens when authority forgets accountability. Charles nodded. Just exactly. As the banquet ended, I carried the framed letter back to my office instead of taking it home. It now hangs on a small shelf beside the first employee badge I received at Brooks Industrial, and the photograph Charles gave me from my wedding. Visitors occasionally ask why anyone would display the document that almost ruined the happiest day of their life. I always give them the same answer. Because it didn't. Ryan interrupted a ceremony. He embarrassed himself in front of strangers. He temporarily complicated my career. But he never took my marriage, my integrity, or the years I spent earning the trust of people who actually knew my work. Those things were never his to take. If there's one lesson my wedding taught me, it's this. Titles can make people believe they own authority, but character determines whether they deserve it. Ryan walked into that ballroom convinced a signature could erase 11 years of honest work. Instead, the paper he carried became the first piece of evidence proving exactly why he should never have been trusted with that authority in the first place. Sometimes, the most satisfying revenge isn't watching someone lose everything. Sometimes it's refusing to lose yourself while they do. The first Monday after our honeymoon felt strangely ordinary, and I was grateful for that. There were no emergency board meetings waiting for me, no lawyers standing outside conference rooms, and no reporters calling the front desk asking whether Brooks Industrial was about to collapse. Employees were back to discussing production schedules, customer deliveries, and vacation requests instead of executive scandals. Walking through the headquarters that morning, I realized something important. Healthy companies don't spend every day talking about leadership. Sterile, they spend most days doing their jobs. Because good leadership quietly allows everyone else to do theirs. Charles had always believed the greatest compliment a leader could receive was becoming almost invisible once the right systems were in place. For the first time since my wedding, Brooks Industrial finally felt like that company again. One of my first decisions as Chief Operating Officer had nothing to do with budgets or manufacturing possible. Together with Karen and Martin, I created a new executive accountability program requiring every senior officer, including me, to complete annual ethics certifications, independent policy reviews, and leadership evaluations conducted by employees as well as peers. Some executives initially questioned whether such oversight was necessary. Charles answered the concern better than I ever could during one leadership meeting. Trust, he said, isn't something executives deserve because of their titles. It's something they borrow from every employee who believes this company will protect honest work. Nobody argued after that. Within months, several other manufacturers contacted us asking for permission to study the program. Ironically, the reforms inspired by Ryan's mistakes became one of Brooks Industrial's strongest competitive advantages because customers increasingly valued companies willing to hold their own leadership accountable. The framed termination letter remained on the shelf in my office, exactly where Charles had suggested placing it. Visitors occasionally stopped to read the large blue void stamp across the front before asking whether it bothered me to look at it every day. The truth surprised most of them. It didn't remind me of humiliation anymore. It reminded me that panic is often the first mistake people make when someone tries to take away something they've earned. Ryan expected me to argue, cry, or create a public confrontation that would distract everyone from the real problem. Instead, one piece of paper quietly became the beginning of an investigation that protected thousands of employees and a company built over 4 decades. Sometimes the strongest response isn't the loudest one. Sometimes it's simply refusing to destroy your own credibility while someone else is busy destroying theirs. A few weeks before Christmas, David and I received a handwritten invitation from Charles asking us to dinner at his home. It wasn't a corporate event. There were no board members, no executives, and no discussions about quarterly reports. Just Charles, his wife Margaret, the two of us, and a meal she insisted on cooking herself despite our repeated offers to help. At one point during dessert, Charles quietly excused himself and returned carrying a small wooden box. "I found this while cleaning my office," he said, sliding it across the table. Inside was the employee identification badge I had worn on my first day at Brooks Industrial 11 years earlier. The photo was terrible. The plastic was scratched, and the magnetic strip no longer worked. I laughed the moment I saw it. "I thought this disappeared years ago." Charles smiled. "I kept it because I had a habit of saving the badges belonging to people who reminded me why I started the company." I didn't know what to say. Some rewards simply can't be measured by salaries or job titles. Driving home that evening, David asked whether I regretted anything that had happened. It was an interesting question, because for months I had focused so much on surviving the crisis that I had never considered the larger picture. Did I wish Ryan had never walked into our wedding? Absolutely. Did I wish Charles had never been forced to choose between protecting his son and protecting his company? Without question. But regret is different from wishing difficult experiences had never existed. Those events revealed people's character in ways ordinary days never could. They showed me exactly who valued integrity when doing so became expensive. Sterile, they also reminded me that careers, companies, and even families are strongest when people are willing to challenge the wrong decision before it grows into something far more damaging. No, I finally answered. I don't regret what happened. I just wish it hadn't needed to happen. About 6 months after the investigation concluded, Brooks Industrial announced the largest employee profit-sharing program in its history. Charles insisted every full-time employee receive a bonus tied directly to the company's record performance, explaining during the announcement that protecting the company's future had been a team effort rather than the achievement of one executive. As applause filled the auditorium, I looked around at hundreds of people whose names would never appear in newspaper articles. Machine operators, engineers, receptionists, accountants, warehouse supervisors, security officers. They were the reason Brooks Industrial still existed, and they had quietly protected it simply by refusing to stop caring about details when details mattered most. Ryan once believed leadership meant having the authority to make everyone else obey. Charles spent 40 years proving leadership meant earning the willingness of ordinary people to trust your decisions. In the end, only one of those philosophies survived. I still keep my wedding dress carefully preserved in the back of our closet. Friends sometimes joke that I should remember it as the dress I wore when my boss's son tried to fire me. I always smile and tell them they're remembering the wrong part of the story. That dress wasn't there when someone tried to end my career. It was there when I married the right person, despite every attempt to ruin the day. The termination letter became evidence. The investigation became history. The promotion became another responsibility. But the promises David and I made to each other remained the only part of that day that truly mattered. Everything else eventually found its proper place. So if someone ever uses a title, a paycheck, or a position to make you believe your worth depends on their approval, remember this. Real authority doesn't announce itself by humiliating people in public. Real leadership doesn't need an audience. And the people most desperate to prove they're in charge are often the ones most afraid of being questioned. Ryan Brooks walked into my wedding, convinced he could erase 11 years of honest work with a single signature. Instead, that signature became the first page of the report that ended his executive career. My wedding wasn't remembered because someone tried to fire the bride. It was remembered because truth arrived before the ceremony was over. And unlike titles, promotions, or power, truth doesn't need permission to stay.